My name is Myra Enfield, and for most of my life, I believed love was something you earned by being useful. I was 32 years old when that belief finally shattered a week ago. My mother stood on my front porch dressed like she was attending a charity luncheon instead of visiting the daughter she had abandoned during the most terrifying night of her life. She wore a cream silk blouse, pearl earrings, and the exact shade of lipstick she always saved for events where wealthy people held wine glasses and pretended to care about each other. Her nails were freshly manicured, her perfume drifted through the doorway before she even spoke, and on her face sat that polished smile she used whenever she needed to look like a loving mother in public. She asked one simple question: "Can I see the baby?" The old version of me would have stepped aside immediately. The old version of me would have ignored the pain in my chest, swallowed the anger, and handed over my newborn daughter, because keeping peace inside the Enfield family had always been my responsibility. But something inside me had changed 5 nights earlier, while I sat alone in the driver's seat of my car, gripping the steering wheel through contractions, trying not to panic as I drove myself to the hospital at 39 weeks pregnant, because my family had decided their dinner party mattered more than I did. So instead of opening the door wider, I looked my mother directly in the eye and asked what baby. The smile disappeared from her face instantly. For a second, she looked genuinely confused, as if she couldn't understand why I was behaving differently. Then came the familiar expression I had seen my entire life whenever I stopped making things easy for her. Annoyance disguised as concern. "Myra," she said slowly, like she was speaking to a difficult child. "Don't be dramatic." Dramatic, that word followed me through my entire childhood. If Victoria cried, she was sensitive. If I cried, I was dramatic. If Victoria wanted attention, she was charming. If I wanted acknowledgement, I was selfish. My family had spent decades training me to shrink myself until I barely took up space at all. From the outside, nobody would have guessed anything was wrong inside the Enfield household. We lived in a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial house in Westbrook, Connecticut, with an in-ground pool, trimmed hedges, and 2 luxury cars always parked neatly in the driveway. My father, Gerald Enfield, owned a successful construction supply company called Enfield and Associates, and my mother, Judith, treated our family like a carefully managed public relations campaign. Every holiday photo looked perfect. Every country club dinner looked elegant. Every fundraiser featured Judith smiling beside important people, while Victoria stood next to her looking like a younger, prettier reflection. Then there was me, quiet, practical, forgettable Myra. I learned very early that in our family, visibility was earned through beauty, charm, and usefulness to other people. Victoria mastered it: naturally blonde curls, effortless laugh, sparkling dresses, perfect posture. People loved her instantly. My mother especially loved the attention Victoria attracted. By the time Victoria was 5 years old, Judith had already started bringing her to charity events and social gatherings like a prized accessory. Guests pinched Victoria's cheeks, called her adorable, admired her dresses, and my mother soaked in every compliment like sunlight. I remember watching them together from the corners of crowded rooms, realizing without anyone saying it aloud that Victoria was the daughter my mother wanted to show off, while I was simply the daughter she had. The favoritism was never obvious enough for outsiders to notice. That was the genius of it. Judith never openly insulted me. She just slowly erased me whenever guests visited our house. She introduced Victoria first every single time. "This is my daughter Victoria," she would say proudly. "She works in communications at her father's company." Then only if someone specifically asked whether she had another child, Judith would glance toward me and add casually, "Oh, and this is Myra. She does engineering." She said it the same way someone might mention accounting software or a weather update. Briefly and without interest. For years, I convinced myself it didn't hurt, because admitting it hurt would mean admitting my own mother didn't value me the same way she valued my sister. Instead, I focused on being dependable. I got excellent grades. I worked part-time jobs. I earned scholarships so my parents wouldn't have to pay my tuition. I learned how to solve problems, because solving problems was the only thing that ever earned me temporary approval. When my father's company nearly collapsed under debt years later, I was the one who saved it through my engineering firm. I had connections with one of the largest commercial developers in New England, and after weeks of calls, negotiations, and meetings, I secured a contract worth millions that kept Enfield and associates from going bankrupt. My father called me crying the night before the deal closed, thanking me over and over because he truly believed he was about to lose everything. For one brief moment, I thought maybe things would finally change between us. Maybe my parents would finally see me. Instead, during the celebration dinner, my father stood in front of investors, clients, and business partners, raised a champagne glass, and publicly thanked Victoria for helping secure the deal while she smiled. Modestly beside him, in a designer cocktail dress, I sat at the end of the table listening to applause meant for someone else, while my own work disappeared into silence. Nobody corrected the mistake, not my mother, not my father, not Victoria, and somehow, unbelievably, not even me. I stayed quiet, because part of me still desperately wanted their love, and children who grow up emotionally neglected learn very quickly that silence often feels safer than disappointment. Then I met Nathan Reeves, the man who became my husband and quietly changed my understanding of what love was supposed to feel like. Nathan was a firefighter with rough hands, tired eyes, and a calmness that made every room feel safer. The moment he entered it, he didn't speak much, but when he did, every word mattered. Nathan never made me compete for affection. He never treated kindness like a reward I had to earn. His mother, Dolores, loved me the same way, openly, warmly, without conditions. The first Thanksgiving she spent with my family, she watched my mother spend 3 straight hours praising Victoria's social life while barely acknowledging me at all. On the drive home, she turned around in her seat and asked softly, "Honey, does your mother always act like Victoria is her only daughter?" I remember staring out the car window, unable to answer, because hearing someone else notice it out loud felt almost unbearable. When I became pregnant, Nathan and I built our little life around excitement for our baby girl. We painted the nursery sage green because I read somewhere the color was calming for infants. Nathan assembled the crib himself after working 48-hour shifts at the fire station. Dolores knitted tiny blankets and called every Sunday to make sure I was eating properly. Meanwhile, my mother barely checked on me unless she wanted to compare my life to Victoria's glamorous engagement plans. Victoria was marrying Derek Blaine, a wealthy businessman who treated relationships like business acquisitions. Together, they hosted extravagant parties full of investors, expensive alcohol, and people who cared deeply about appearances. Even at 36 weeks pregnant, Victoria invited me to her engagement celebration, not as a guest, but as unpaid labor. She asked me to arrive early to help set up decorations and subtly suggested I avoid wearing anything too casual because important people would be attending. I should have said no. Instead, I spent hours arranging flowers and carrying chairs while contractions occasionally tightened across my stomach. That night became the final rehearsal for what happened days later. My mother ignored my discomfort entirely. Guests assumed I worked for the catering company. One woman actually asked if I was staff, and before I could respond, Judith laughed lightly and said, "Oh no, that's Myra. She's just helping out, just helping out." That phrase echoed in my mind for days afterward because it perfectly summarized my role in the family. I was never the daughter worth celebrating. I was the daughter expected to quietly serve everyone else while asking for nothing in return. Then came Saturday night. 39 weeks pregnant, Nathan stuck on shift at the fire station. 16 people crowded into my parents' dining room for another elaborate dinner party while I stood trembling in the hallway trying to breathe through contractions that had suddenly become sharp and terrifying. I called my mother because I was scared, because despite everything, some childish part of me still believed mothers showed up when their daughters truly needed them. Judith answered the phone, irritated because I had interrupted dessert when I told her I thought I was in labor and needed help getting to the hospital. There was a pause before she sighed impatiently and said, "Can't you just call a cab? We have guests here." That was the moment something inside me finally broke beyond repair. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, permanently. I drove myself to the hospital alone that night while tears blurred the road in front of me, and somewhere between the contractions, the fear, and the loneliness, I stopped being the invisible daughter begging for scraps of love from people who had already decided I mattered less. Derek leaned casually against the bar with a half-finished glass of bourbon in his hand, smiling the way experienced businessmen smile when they already know the answer to the question they are about to ask. Everything about him felt calculated. The loosened tie, the relaxed posture, the confident little pauses between sentences designed to make people reveal more than they intended. "So, Myra," he said smoothly, "Victoria tells me you're a structural engineer." I Nodded once he swirled the bourbon slowly, ice tapping against the crystal glass. Interesting field. Must be complicated. I gave a small shrug. Sometimes his eyes narrowed slightly, studying me the way investors study blueprints before deciding where to put their money. I was reviewing some of your father's company history. He continued. That Harrove development contract from a few years ago. That pretty much saved the entire business, didn't it? I felt my stomach tighten, though not from pregnancy this time. It helped, I answered carefully. Derek smiled wider. Victoria mentioned she was the one who arranged that partnership. I didn't respond immediately. I simply picked up my water glass, letting the silence stretch between us. Derek noticed. Men like him always noticed hesitation, because hesitation usually meant leverage. Funny thing, he continued, lowering his voice slightly. A friend of mine at Harrove mentioned an Enfield woman who handled the introduction. Said she was an engineer. Definitely not Victoria's area. He tilted his head. That was you, wasn't it? Around us, laughter floated through the room while the string quartet played softly in the corner. But suddenly the party felt quieter, sharper, dangerous in a way I couldn't fully explain. I met his eyes for the first time. You should ask Victoria, I said evenly. Derek let out a short laugh, clipped and knowing like a receipt printing from a machine. I think I just got my answer. Then he walked away without another word, disappearing back into the crowd of investors and polished socialites. I stood there frozen beside the bar, one hand resting against the curve of my stomach, and realized something important. Derek had done research before marrying into the Enfield family. He knew exactly who had secured that contract. He knew Victoria had taken credit for my work, and worse, he knew the rest of my family had allowed it. But he hadn't exposed the lie. Because men like Derek didn't care about fairness, they cared about usefulness. In that moment, I could practically feel him assessing me like a tool sitting forgotten in a drawer. Something undervalued, something potentially useful. Later, the realization made my skin crawl. At exactly 8 o'clock, Judith called everyone's attention for a toast. She stood near the fireplace, holding a champagne flute beneath the soft glow of chandelier light, looking elegant and perfectly composed, like the hostess of a luxury magazine photo shoot. For 3 straight minutes, she spoke about Victoria. Our daughter is extraordinary, she said proudly. Our daughter has always brought light into every room. Our daughter deserves every happiness. She used the phrase our daughter 5 separate times, each one aimed directly at Victoria. While the guests smiled and nodded approvingly, I sat quietly near the back of the room, one hand pressed against my aching lower spine, waiting for my mother to acknowledge me. Even once, she never did. Then one of the investors laughed politely and asked, so where's the rest of the family tonight? Judith smiled without missing a beat. We can only afford one daughter this evening. The room erupted with light social laughter, the kind people use when they don't want to think too deeply about what was just said. But across the room, Nathan had just arrived from the fire station, still wearing part of his uniform jacket, exhaustion written across his face. After a long shift, he didn't laugh. His jaw tightened instantly. I felt him move beside me. A second later, his hand settling gently against my elbow. Say the word, he murmured quietly. We leave right now. I wanted to, God, I wanted to, but years of conditioning wrapped around me like chains. Not here, I whispered. Not now. Nathan looked toward my mother, standing proudly beside Victoria, then back at me. I could tell he was holding back anger for my sake. I twisted the old silver bracelet around my wrist without thinking, the one my father gave me when I was 10 years old. The only gift that had ever truly felt meant for me. I should have left that night. Looking back, I know that now, but 3 weeks later something happened that made the engagement party seem almost harmless by comparison. 3 weeks passed slowly. I reached 39 weeks pregnant, my due date only 4 days away. The baby had dropped lower, and every movement felt heavy and uncomfortable. Sleep became impossible. Even walking across the kitchen left pressure twisting through my hips and lower back. On Tuesday evening, my father called unexpectedly. Gerald never called unless my mother asked him to. Your mother is hosting another dinner Saturday, he explained awkwardly. Big investors this time. Derek organized at Patterson Group. Potential $5 million contract. I leaned against the kitchen counter, already exhausted. Dad, I'm due in 4 days. Silence filled the line for several seconds. I heard the television in the background at their house, some financial news channel Judith always kept playing because she thought it made the house sound important. Finally, my father sighed softly. I know, sweetheart. I'm sure everything will be fine. Fine, that word again. The Enfields used fine the same way other families use denial. My father cleared his throat nervously. Your mother was wondering if maybe you could come early, help With seating arrangements, I closed my eyes, 39 weeks pregnant, carrying my first child, barely able to bend comfortably anymore, and my family still saw me primarily as unpaid event staff. I can't promise anything, I said quietly. Of course, he replied, quickly relieved by even the possibility I might still obey. We understand, but he didn't understand. He understood, Judith. There was a difference. After hanging up, I immediately called Nathan at the station. He answered on the second ring. What's wrong? Firefighters always answer like that because they expect emergencies. Nothing yet, I said softly. But if something happens Saturday, I might be alone. The line stayed quiet for a second. Investor dinner. He guessed immediately. Yeah, Nathan exhaled slowly. Then you won't be alone. I'll leave early if I have to. Later that night, he texted me again after speaking with his fire chief. Chief Galloway said, family comes first. I can leave anytime you need. I stared at that message for a long time because a man I had met twice cared more about my safety than my own parents did. Saturday arrived, cold and gray, carrying the heavy feeling of an approaching storm. I drove to my parents' house against every instinct telling me not to go because earlier that morning my father had called one final time and quietly said, your mother needs you. 3 words carefully designed to trigger guilt I had carried since childhood. The Enfield house looked transformed when I arrived. 16 formal place settings line the dining table, linen napkins folded perfectly, candles flickered beside imported flower arrangements. A catering van sat parked behind the house while servers in black aprons assembled an enormous charcuterie display in the kitchen. Victoria stood near the foyer, wearing a fitted red dress with diamond earrings Derek had gifted her, looking flawless and expensive and perfectly prepared for admiration. She looked exactly like the daughter my mother had always wanted. Judith descended the staircase moments later in a navy dress, adjusting one pearl earring as her perfume filled the hallway. She saw me standing there, visibly exhausted and heavily pregnant, and her first words were not, hello, good you're here. She said briskly, can you check the place cards in the dining room? No greeting, no concern, no how are you feeling? Just another task. I walked into the dining room and checked the table arrangement carefully. 16 names written neatly in elegant calligraphy. Investors, spouses, Victoria, Derek, Gerald, Judith. No, Myra. I looked up. Mom, there's no place card for me. Judith barely glanced over. Oh, we ran out of ivory cards. Just pull up a chair near the kitchen. You'll probably be more comfortable there anyway. Near the kitchen, beside the servers, not even at the actual table. I stared down at the seating arrangement while a tight contraction spread slowly across my lower back. Mild but unmistakable. I gripped the edge of the dining table and breathed through it silently until the pain eased. Then I checked my phone. Nathan had texted 15 minutes earlier. Shift ends at 10. I can leave by 9:30 if needed. Just say the word. I typed back automatically, I'm fine. But I wasn't fine. I was still pretending. The guests arrived promptly. At 7, Derek moved through the room, shaking hands and charming investors like a politician campaigning for office. Eventually, he introduced my father to Victor Patterson, the head of the investment group. A silver-haired man in his late 60s with the polished confidence of generational wealth. Beside him stood his wife, Margaret Patterson, the same elegant woman who had spoken to me at the engagement party weeks earlier. She recognized me instantly. During dinner, she quietly approached my end of the table where an empty seat beside me waited for Nathan. We met before, she said gently. You're the engineer. I nodded cautiously. I remember. Margaret lowered her voice. Dan Whitfield from Harrove mentioned you once, said you were impressive. I forced a small smile. That was a long time ago. She studied my face for several seconds while conversations and laughter continued around us. Then she said something that stopped me cold. You don't look like someone who chooses to stay invisible, she said quietly. You look like someone who was taught to. Before I could answer, another contraction hit harder. This time, I gripped the edge of the table, so suddenly my water glass rattled. Margaret immediately reached toward me. Are you all right? Just tired, I lied through clenched teeth. But she didn't believe me, neither did I. The contraction lasted nearly 8 seconds before releasing, and I realized with growing panic that the intervals were shortening, 12 minutes apart, then 9. This wasn't false labor anymore. My daughter was coming at 9:15. Another wave of pain rolled through me, sharp enough to steal my breath completely. I pushed back my chair and walked toward the living room where Judith stood entertaining investors' wives beside the fireplace. I touched her elbow gently. Mom, I need to talk to you. She followed me into the Hallway reluctantly, clearly irritated at being interrupted. I think I'm in labor, I said quietly. The contractions are getting close together. Judith looked at me for exactly 1 second before glancing back toward the guests. Myra, not now, she whispered sharply. We're in the middle of dinner. I need someone to take me to the hospital. Where's Nathan? 40 minutes away. He's still on shift. My mother sighed impatiently and straightened her necklace. Then wait for him first. Babies take forever anyway. You're probably overreacting. Another contraction hit instantly. I grabbed the hallway table hard enough to rattle the vase, sitting on top of it. White lilies trembled violently. Judith watched me double over in pain and did absolutely nothing. No concern, no movement, no instinct to help her daughter in that moment, staring at her perfectly composed face. While pain tore through my body, I finally understood the truth I had spent 29 years avoiding. She was never going to choose me, not tonight. Not ever. I straightened slowly, breathing hard, and walked back toward the dining room where my father stood calmly pouring expensive Bordeaux for investors while my labor intensified. Only feet away. Everything about Gerald Enfield was steady, because steadiness was the closest thing he had to courage. His hands never shook, his voice never rose, his smile stayed calm, even when things were falling apart around him. That was how he survived 29 years. Married to Judith Enfield. By becoming so emotionally motionless that nobody could accuse him of choosing sides, even when his silence was a choice. Every single time I stood in the dining room, gripping the edge of a chair while another contraction tightened through my body like a steel cable pulling from the inside. The candles flickered softly across the polished table. Expensive wine swirled in crystal glasses. Investors laughed at some story Derek was telling near the fireplace while my labor intensified. Only feet away from them, Dad, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. I need to go to the hospital now. My father looked at me for a long moment. For one fragile second, I thought maybe this would finally be the moment he stood up. Maybe this would be the moment he remembered I was his daughter before I was an inconvenience. But then his eyes shifted toward Judith, who had just entered the room behind me. She didn't say anything at first. She simply gave the smallest shake of her head, barely noticeable to anyone else, but I noticed. I had spent my entire childhood decoding those silent signals. That tiny movement had controlled our entire family for decades. Gerald cleared his throat awkwardly. Honey, he began softly, can it wait another hour? We're right in the middle of my contractions are 8 minutes apart. I interrupted before he could respond. Derek appeared in the doorway, adjusting his loosened tie, drink still in hand, clearly having listened to the entire exchange from the hallway. She can take a cab, can't she? He asked casually. We're about to close the Patterson deal. Then my mother said the sentence I will hear echoing in my head for the rest of my life. She didn't yell. She didn't even look directly at me. She simply refolded a napkin near the table and said in the calmest voice imaginable, call a cab. Myra, we're busy. 16 people sat in that room. 16 investors, spouses, servers, moving between courses. My father, my mother, my sister, Derek. Not one person stood up. Not one person said, I'll drive you. Not one person even looked uncomfortable enough to challenge her. The conversation only paused briefly before resuming around me like nothing important had happened. Candles kept burning, glasses kept clinking. Judith's jasmine perfume drifted through the room, stronger than ever, sweet and cold and suffocating. I stood there in absolute silence for what felt like an entire lifetime, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds, long enough to memorize every face in that room, long enough to realize I wasn't simply being ignored anymore. I was being erased completely, quietly, intentionally. I turned without another word, picked up my keys from the hallway table, and walked toward the front door. The string quartet had already packed up earlier that evening, so the only sound left in the house was the soft echo of my shoes crossing the marble floor. Nobody followed me. Nobody called my name. Nobody even asked if I was okay. I opened the door and stepped into the cold October night air. The front door clicked shut behind me with a sharp metallic sound that echoed in the darkness. I didn't know it then, but that click would become the final sound I ever heard inside my parents' house. I stood in the driveway, breathing through another contraction, while warm tears blurred my vision, though I refused to let myself cry. Not there, not for them. The porch light glowed warmly above the entrance, but it wasn't turned on for me. It was turned on for guests. My hands shook so badly I dropped my key fob twice before finally unlocking the Honda. The seat felt freezing when I climbed inside. I adjusted the rearview mirror automatically and caught sight of my own reflection. Pale skin, wet eyes, jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. I barely recognized myself. Another contraction hit almost immediately, stronger this time. I braced both hands against the steering wheel and forced myself to breathe slowly until it passed 7 minutes apart. Now closer, faster reel. I grabbed my phone and called Nathan. He answered before the first ring even finished. What's wrong? He asked immediately. I'm driving myself to the hospital, I whispered. Silence exploded on the line. What? Nathan's voice sharpened instantly. No. Absolutely not. I'm leaving right now. You're 40 minutes away, I said. St. Mary's is 18 minutes from here. I can make it, Myra. Nathan, I'm going. I hung up before he could argue, because if I heard too much concern in his voice, I might finally break down. The drive to St. Mary's Hospital lasted 18 minutes. It felt like an entire year. Every red light seemed cruelly personal, every second stretching endlessly, while contractions rolled through my body. Stronger and stronger. Streetlights blurred through tears I refused to acknowledge. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white and pressed the gas pedal carefully with swollen feet shoved into old brown leather flats I had owned since my 20s, the soles worn thin from years of engineering job sites. Between contractions, I focused on numbers, because numbers felt safer than emotions. 4 red lights, 3 contractions, 0 missed calls from anyone named Enfield. By the time I pulled into the hospital parking lot, I was trembling so badly I barely parked straight. A nurse with bright red hair met me near the entrance, pushing a wheelchair. Her name tag read Colleen. Where's your support person? She asked while helping me sit. He's coming, I managed through another contraction. Who drove you? I hesitated. I did. Colleen looked at me carefully. Then 39 weeks pregnant, sweating, shaking, completely alone. And whatever she saw on my face made her stop asking questions. She simply squeezed my arm gently and wheeled me inside. I will remember every second of that hallway for the rest of my life. The bright hospital lights, the sharp antiseptic smell, the squeak of the wheelchair wheels against the floor, the strange quietness of being cared for by strangers more tenderly than my own family had ever cared for me. By 10:20 p.m. I was settled in labor and delivery room, for the bed sheets felt cold against my skin. Monitors beeped softly around me while contractions intensified every 5 minutes. Colleen checked my chart and nodded. 4 centimeters active labor. She wrote something down near the top of the paperwork before setting the clipboard aside. I glanced at the note. Accidentally, patient arrived alone, self-transported, no emergency contact present at admission. The words hit harder than I expected. There it was, my entire family history summarized in one sterile hospital sentence. Colleen adjusted the blanket gently over my legs. Your husband's on the way. He's a firefighter, I explained quietly. He's coming from shift, okay? She said softly. You're doing great. Then she stepped outside, leaving me alone in the humming hospital room with my phone glowing on the bedside table. That's when I saw the notification from the Enfield family group chat. Victoria had accidentally added me back into it the week before while sending engagement seating arrangements, and apparently forgot to remove me afterward. Normally I ignored it, but labor strips away denial, pain removes performance. You stop pretending things don't hurt. I opened the messages. Victoria. OMG, Myra just made a scene about going to the hospital. Judith. I told her to call a cab. She's always dramatic. Derek Patterson almost walked out. Control your daughter, Gerald. Then finally my father's response. 3 simple words. She left. It's handled. I stared at the screen while another contraction tore through me. She left. It's handled. Not is she safe? Not did she get there? Not that's my daughter. Just handled, like I was a scheduling issue, like I was a problem. Removed from the room. My eyes dropped slowly to the silver bracelet still wrapped around my wrist, the bracelet my father gave me when I turned 10 years old, the bracelet I had worn every single day for 22 years because it represented the one moment I truly believed he saw me. But suddenly it felt unbearably heavy. Not silver anymore. Evidence, proof that someone can love you once and still fail you completely. Later, the hospital room door burst open at 10:35 p.m. Nathan rushed inside, still wearing his station boots and partially unbuttoned uniform collar, breathing hard from running through the hospital. The second he reached the bed, he grabbed my hand tightly. I'm here. 2 words, simple, immediate, certain. The exact words I had needed all night, and unlike my parents, Nathan didn't make me earn them. First, labor lasted through the entire night. Contractions crashed through my body in waves, so intense they blurred time itself. Nathan never left my side. Once he held my hand, wiped my forehead with cold towels, counted my breathing, whispered encouragement into my hair whenever panic threatened to overwhelm me. Around 3:17 Sunday morning, our daughter finally arrived, screaming into the world with 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a full head of dark hair that made Colleen laugh softly and say, well, she came prepared. Nathan cried openly the moment he saw her hands over his mouth, eyes red, shoulders shaking uncontrollably. He looked at our daughter like she was the first truly beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. They placed her against my chest, skin to skin, her tiny heartbeat fluttering rapidly against mine, and for the first time in years, I felt something inside me grow, quiet, not healed, not fixed, but quiet. I named her Eloise. Reeves. Nathan fell asleep in the recliner sometime around 5 in the morning, holding Eloise against his chest while sunrise slowly crept through the hospital blinds. That was when I finally checked my phone again. No missed calls, no congratulations, no apologies, zero contact from anyone in the Enfield family. The group chat had already moved on to discussing the investor dinner. Victoria had even uploaded an Instagram story sometime after midnight, showing champagne glasses beneath golden chandelier lighting with a caption, "Best night ever, best night ever." While I delivered her niece 18 minutes away, completely alone at 6 in the morning, Dolores arrived carrying homemade chicken soup, a quilt sewn decades earlier by her own mother, and a stuffed teddy bear wearing a tiny firefighter helmet. She walked straight to my bedside without hesitation and said, "Let me see my grandbaby." Then she held Eloise with the confidence and tenderness of a woman who understood exactly what family was supposed to look like. She touched my cheek gently afterward and whispered, "You did good, sweetheart. Now rest, I've got her." She never asked about the investor dinner, never checked her phone, never made the moment about herself. She simply showed up, and sitting there watching her rock my daughter beneath the soft morning sunlight, I finally understood the difference between the family you are born into and the family that chooses you willingly every single day. Monday passed, nothing. Tuesday passed, nothing. Wednesday passed, still nothing. Not one Enfield call to ask if I survived childbirth, not one text asking for photos, not even a cheap bouquet from a grocery store. Nathan brought me and Eloise home Wednesday afternoon while Dolores quietly stocked our refrigerator, cleaned the kitchen, and left a handwritten note on the counter that read, "Casserole and oven, call anytime, especially at 3 a.m. That first night home, I sat alone in the nursery at 2 in the morning, nursing Eloise beneath the soft glow of the nightlight. The sage green walls I had painted myself suddenly looked different, somehow quieter, sadder. I looked down at the silver bracelet still circling my wrist and realized I was waiting again, waiting for my family to finally notice me, waiting for an apology that would never come, waiting for love from people who had already shown me exactly who they were. Slowly, I unclasped the bracelet for the first time in years. I held it carefully in my palm, tracing the faded engraving of my own name one last time. 22 years of hope sat inside that tiny piece of silver. Then I walked to the closet, found an old shoebox, placed the bracelet inside, closed the lid, and set it on the top shelf. Nathan stirred awake when I climbed back into bed. "Have you heard from your parents?" he asked quietly. "No," I whispered. Nathan stared at me for a long moment, then got up without another word and went to make tea. Because sometimes love isn't dramatic speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes love is simply the person who stays awake with you in the silence after everyone else has failed you. Nathan picked up Eloise carefully from the bassinet and held her against his chest like she was something sacred, something the world did not deserve access to unless it learned how to be gentle first. "The people who show up," he answered quietly. "That's what counts as family." His words settled over the room softly, but they carried more weight than every speech Judith Enfield had ever made at every fundraiser, every country club dinner, every polished charity event where appearances mattered more than truth. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching my husband rock our daughter slowly beneath the afternoon sunlight spilling through the windows, and for the first time in my entire life, the idea of family stopped feeling complicated. It stopped feeling conditional. Family was not blood. It was not obligation. It was not people who expected loyalty while offering none in return. Family was the person who drove across town at midnight, the woman who stocked your refrigerator without being asked, the hands that held you steady while your entire world shifted beneath your feet. 2 weeks after my mother stood on my porch pretending nothing had happened, the entire situation had spread quietly through our extended family like smoke under a locked door. Judith had tried to control the narrative the way she always did, through concern carefully disguised as victimhood. She called relatives, crying softly into the phone about how worried she was for me, implying I was unstable after childbirth, implying I was keeping Eloise away out of irrational emotion instead of self-protection. She never mentioned the Hospital never mentioned the dinner, never mentioned telling her pregnant daughter to call a cab, while 16 people sat comfortably eating filet mignon under candlelight. That part somehow disappeared from her version of events, but truth has a strange way of surviving even when people try to bury it, especially simple truth. Ask her what happened Saturday night at 9:15. That became my only response every single time another relative called trying to guilt me. I never explained further. I didn't rant, I didn't defend myself. I simply handed them the timestamp and let silence do the rest. One by one the calls stopped because people can ignore emotions, they can debate opinions, but specific moments are harder to escape. A pregnant woman asking for help, a mother refusing a daughter, driving herself to the hospital alone. Even Judith's carefully polished social circle couldn't smooth that into something acceptable by the third week. Church gossip had already started turning against her quietly. Dolores heard about it first through a friend from Bible study. Apparently, two women from Grace Lutheran had questioned why Judith never posted a single hospital photo with her granddaughter despite posting pictures of nearly every major family event for the last decade. Another woman reportedly asked why nobody from the Enfield family had been present during delivery if they were supposedly so close. Tiny cracks, tiny questions, but cracks spread quickly once people start looking too closely at perfection. Judith hated scrutiny more than anything. Meanwhile, life inside our little townhouse settled into a fragile rhythm. Sleepless nights, bottles warming at 2 a.m, tiny socks disappearing mysteriously in the dryer, Nathan walking through the front door after exhausting firehouse shifts just to immediately take Eloise from my arms so I could shower or sleep for an hour. We were tired constantly, but it was honest exhaustion, the kind that comes from building something real instead of performing happiness for other people. Dolores visited almost daily, never overstaying, never criticizing, never making motherhood feel like another competition I had to survive. Sometimes she simply folded laundry while humming softly to Eloise. Sometimes she brought soup. Sometimes she sat beside me during feedings and told funny stories about Nathan. As a little boy, she filled the house with calm instead of judgment. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Gerald appeared again. Without warning this time, he looked even worse than before. His shoulders sagged beneath his coat like he had aged years in a month. He stood awkwardly near the doorway while rainwater dripped from the edge of his sleeves. Can I see her? He asked quietly, not demanding, not entitled, just tired. I hesitated for several seconds before finally stepping aside. Gerald walked in slowly, almost cautiously, like he was entering a home where he no longer knew the rules. Eloise was asleep in her swing near the window, wrapped in a pale yellow blanket Dolores had knitted. My father stood over her silently for nearly a full minute before speaking. She has her eyes, he whispered. I folded my arms tightly. Why are you here, Dad? He rubbed a hand across his face heavily. Your mother doesn't understand why you're doing this. I laughed once under my breath, sharp and humorless. No, I said softly. She understands perfectly. She just doesn't like consequences. Gerald sat down slowly at the kitchen table, staring at his hands the way people do when they know they failed something important years ago and only just realized it's too late to undo the damage. Things weren't always like this, he said. Eventually, your mother. He stopped himself. Your mother cares about appearances too much, and you cared about keeping her happy more than protecting me, I replied. He flinched slightly, because both of us knew it was true. The silence stretched painfully between us. Finally, he spoke again, voice lower. Now, I thought if I stayed out of the conflict, eventually things would settle down. That's the problem, I answered quietly. You think silence is neutral. It's not. Silence always protects the person already holding power. Gerald looked toward Eloise, sleeping peacefully near the window. I never wanted you to feel unloved. The words almost broke me because part of me had waited my entire life to hear them, but another part, the stronger part now, understood something important. Hearing the right words too late does not erase years of wrong actions. Intentions don't change outcomes, I said softly. I still drove myself to the hospital alone. He lowered his head. After that, truly lowered it for the first time in my life. My father looked ashamed, not defensive, not quiet, ashamed. Before leaving, he walked to the bassinet one last time and gently touched Eloise's tiny hand with one finger. I hope she never doubts she matters, he whispered. Then he left before I could answer. After the door closed behind him, I stood there thinking about how tragedy often moves through families silently from one generation to the next until someone finally decides to stop carrying it forward. Judith inherited performance from her mother, Gerald Inherited avoidance from his father. Victoria inherited entitlement because she was rewarded for it her entire life, and me, I inherited silence, the ability to absorb pain quietly while pretending everything was fine. But sitting there in the soft afternoon light with my daughter sleeping peacefully nearby, I realized inheritance is not destiny. Patterns can end. Someone just has to be willing to disappoint the people who benefit from them. Continuing. The christening arrived 3 weeks later on a crisp Sunday morning in late October. Grace Community Church smelled faintly of old wood candle wax and fresh coffee from the fellowship hall downstairs. Pastor Williams greeted us warmly near the entrance, while Nathan carried Eloise dressed in a tiny ivory gown Dolores had sewn herself by hand. The front pew was reserved exactly as promised. Nathan, me, Dolores, family, real family. Guests filtered in quietly over the next 20 minutes. A few cousins, Nathan's firehouse crew, Dolores's longtime church friends. Then 10 minutes before the ceremony started, I saw Judith enter the church. She wore black, not funeral black exactly, but dramatic black, the kind designed to communicate suffering without words. Victoria walked beside her carrying an outrageously expensive handbag, while Derek followed behind looking deeply uncomfortable for the first time since I had met him. Gerald entered last, slower than everyone else. Tired Judith immediately scanned the sanctuary, searching for us. When she spotted the reserved front pew and realized there were no seats waiting for them, her expression tightened instantly. Pastor Williams intercepted them gently near the aisle. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I saw Judith's smile strain at the edges while the pastor calmly explained seating arrangements. Eventually, they sat 3 rows behind us, not beside us, behind us, symbolically and emotionally exactly where they belonged now. During the ceremony, Eloise slept peacefully in Nathan's arms while warm light poured through the stained glass windows overhead. Pastor Williams spoke softly about responsibility, love, and the sacred duty parents have to make children feel safe in this world. A child learns who they are, he said, by watching how they are treated by the people closest to them. The words landed heavily in my chest. I glanced back only once during the ceremony. Judith sat perfectly still, lips pressed tightly together, hands folded so rigidly in her lap they almost looked painful. For the first time in my life, she looked powerless, not because I had screamed at her, not because I humiliated her publicly, but because I stopped participating in the illusion she spent decades building. After the ceremony ended, people gathered outside beneath the church steps, smiling, taking photos, passing Eloise carefully between loving hands. Nathan's fire chief held her proudly for pictures. Dolores cried openly while adjusting the baby blanket. Laughter floated through the cold autumn air, real laughter this time, not performance, not networking, just warmth. Judith approached carefully while I stood near the railing holding Eloise. She's beautiful, she said quietly. I nodded once. She is my mother. Hesitated, probably waiting for the old version of me to make this easier for her to apologize for boundaries she forced me to create, but I stayed silent. Eventually, she spoke again. I made mistakes. The sentence sounded physically painful for her to say. I looked down at Eloise sleeping peacefully against my chest. Yes, I answered simply. Judith swallowed hard. Can we move forward? I thought about the hospital, the empty driveway, the unanswered calls, the group chat, the years of being invisible long before labor ever started. Then I looked back at my mother standing there in expensive black heels beneath the church steps, waiting for immediate forgiveness, the same way she expected immediate access to everything else in life. Maybe someday, I said calmly, but not today. She nodded slowly, eyes glassy with restrained emotion, and stepped back. No screaming, no dramatic confrontation, just truth finally standing in daylight where everyone could see it clearly. Nathan wrapped an arm around my shoulders as the church bells rang softly overhead. Dolores kissed Eloise's forehead. Somewhere behind us, autumn leaves skittered across the pavement in the cold wind, and standing there surrounded by people who had actually shown up for us, I realized something I wish I had understood years earlier. Love is not measured by who shares your blood. Love is measured by who stays when staying becomes inconvenient. Behind Judith came Gerald in a charcoal suit that suddenly looked too large for him, as if the last month had hollowed him out from the inside. Victoria followed several steps behind, wearing cream wool and carrying herself stiffly. Her usual polished confidence cracked around the edges. For the first time since I could remember, she looked uncertain entering a room. There was no Derek beside her, no designer smile, no carefully rehearsed performance, just silence, and expensive heels clicking against old church wood. Judith paused halfway down the aisle. When she realized the front pew was already full, Nathan sat beside me, holding Eloise carefully against his chest, while Dolores adjusted the tiny blanket near the baby's shoulders. With grandmotherly precision, real family occupied the places closest to my daughter. Judith's eyes locked onto the pew for one long second. I watched the exact moment she understood this had not been an oversight, it had been a decision. Pastor Williams approached before she could speak. Calm voice, warm smile. Good morning, Judith. We've reserved seating right over here for you. Third pew, not hidden, not humiliated, just placed exactly where boundaries had finally drawn themselves. Judith's lips tightened almost invisibly. I'm the grandmother, she said softly enough to sound polite. To anyone not listening carefully, Pastor Williams nodded kindly. And we're glad you came then. He gently motioned toward the seats. Conversation over. Judith stood perfectly still for half a heartbeat longer, calculating whether making a scene in church would cost her more social damage than accepting the seat. Quietly, calculation won it always. Did. She sat down in the third pew beside Gerald, while Victoria lowered herself next to them. Without speaking, the white roses remained clutched tightly in Judith's hands like props waiting for a cue that never came. The service began exactly at 10. Organ music floated softly through the sanctuary while sunlight poured through the stained glass and gold and blue ribbons across the floorboards. Eloise slept through nearly all of it, tiny fingers curled against Nathan's tie. Pastor Williams spoke about responsibility, protection, and the sacred obligation adults have to create safe homes for children. A child, he said, gently learns her worth first from the people entrusted to care for her. The words moved through the church quietly, but I felt them hit the Enfield pew like stones dropped into still water. I did not turn around. I didn't need to. Some truths become heavy enough to feel without looking directly at them. When it came time for the christening itself, Nathan carried Eloise forward while I stood beside him beneath the soft glow of stained glass light. Pastor Williams dipped his fingers into the baptismal water and touched our daughter's forehead. Gently, Eloise Margaret Reeves, he said warmly. May you always know you are deeply loved, fiercely protected, and never alone, never alone. 3 words nearly broke me because for most of my life alone had been the quiet condition beneath everything. Alone at graduations, alone at family dinners, alone while everyone else's achievements were celebrated louder than my existence. Alone driving through contractions toward a hospital while 16 people stayed seated at a dining table pretending business mattered more than blood. But standing there beside Nathan while his hand rested firmly against my back, with Dolores smiling through tears in the front pew and Colleen the nurse dabbing at her eyes 3 rows behind us, I realized something enormous. I was not alone anymore. Maybe I never truly had been. Maybe I had simply spent too many years trying to earn love from people who only valued performance. After the ceremony, guests gathered in the fellowship hall downstairs where folding tables held coffee, pastries, fruit trays, and a cake. Dolores had baked herself at 4 in the morning. Nothing extravagant, nothing catered, no string quartet, no imported champagne. And somehow it felt warmer than every Enfield event combined. Nathan's fellow firefighters passed Eloise around carefully, like she was made of glass. My coworkers asked about sleep schedules and daycare plans instead of promotions or appearances. Colleen hugged me tightly and whispered, I'm glad you weren't alone that night. After all, I nearly cried at that. Judith lingered near the dessert table for almost 20 minutes before finally approaching me directly. Gerald stayed behind her looking exhausted. Victoria hovered farther back, pretending to study the photographs on the church bulletin board. My mother stopped in front of me, bouquet still in hand, smile professionally assembled. The ceremony was beautiful, she said carefully. Thank you, I replied. A long silence stretched between us. Around the room, conversations softened slightly as people sensed tension gathering like static before a storm. Judith extended the bouquet toward me. These are for Eloise. I looked at the roses, but did not take them immediately. White roses, elegant, expensive, late. Everything with Judith was always late. Apologies arrived after damage. Affection arrived after audiences. Concern arrived only when reputation required it. Finally, I accepted the flowers because refusing them publicly would create exactly the spectacle she understood how to manipulate best. Thank you, I said again. She glanced toward Eloise sleeping peacefully in Dolores's arms nearby. Can I hold her there? It was the real reason she came, not accountability, access. I looked at my daughter, then back at the woman standing in front of me. Not today. Judith blinked once, stunned less by the refusal itself than by the calmness of it. The old version of me would have folded beneath pressure. By now the old version would have apologized for having needs. This version did neither. Myra, she said, quietly, warning threading beneath the syllables. People are watching. I know, I answered softly. That used to matter more to you than it did to me. Her composure cracked for half a second. Tiny but visible Gerald stepped forward. Before she could respond, can we talk privately? He asked. I hesitated, then nodded toward an empty classroom near the hallway. We stepped inside together. While the church noise muffled behind the closed door, Gerald looked at me for a long moment before reaching into his coat pocket. Slowly, he placed the small jewelry box on the table between us. The bracelet, you left this behind, he said quietly. No, I answered. I put it away. He stared at the box. Your mother doesn't understand why you can't just move on. I laughed softly, tired more than amused, because moving on is easy for the person who never had to carry the hurt. Gerald sat down heavily in one of the folding chairs. The Patterson deal collapsing almost destroyed the company. I crossed my arms. Dad, you keep talking about contracts like they're the tragedy here. He rubbed both hands across his face. I know. Silence settled between us, honest silence this time. Finally, he looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I failed you. The words landed harder than I expected, because I had wanted them for so long, as a child, as a teenager, as a woman sitting alone in labor, and now here they were, years late and painfully real. Yes, I whispered. Gerald nodded slowly, like he deserved nothing softer. I kept telling myself keeping peace was the same thing as protecting the family. It protected Mom, I replied gently. Not me. He looked toward the hallway, where faint church laughter drifted through the walls. I don't know how to fix this. I looked down at the jewelry box resting between us. 22 years of scratches hidden inside. 22 years of hoping a bracelet could substitute for being chosen consistently. Maybe you can, I said honestly. Some things don't go back to how they were. Gerald closed his eyes briefly. I miss my daughter. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes then, because the terrible thing was, I miss my father too, not the man who sat silently through dinners while Judith erased me, the earlier version, the one who sat on the edge of a 10-year-old girl's bed and told her a bracelet was just for her, the man he could have been if fear had not hollowed him out slowly over decades. I slid the jewelry box back toward him across the table. Keep it, I said softly. I don't need proof anymore. Gerald stared at the box for several seconds before placing his hand over it carefully, almost reverently. When we returned to the fellowship hall, Judith immediately stood searching our faces for signs of allegiance, victory, control. Anything she could still organize into a story where she remained central, but something had shifted permanently, now not dramatically, quietly, like ice finally cracking after years under pressure. Nathan walked toward me, carrying Eloise against his shoulder. Without hesitation, he placed our daughter into my arms and kissed the side of my head gently in front of everyone. Not performative, natural, familiar, safe. Dolores smiled from across the room while Colleen snapped a candid photo at exactly that moment, me holding Eloise, Nathan beside me, sunlight through church windows behind us. No pearls, no speeches, no pretending, just people who showed up. Judith watched all of it silently, and for the first time in my entire life, I think she realized something irreversible. She had spent decades building a perfect image of family while neglecting the actual thing itself. Meanwhile, I had built something quieter, smaller, imperfect. Real guests slowly began leaving. Afternoon hugs, leftover cake packed into containers, folding chairs scraped gently across the church floor. By 12:45, the fellowship hall was nearly empty. Judith and Gerald stood near the doorway, preparing to leave. Victoria lingered awkwardly beside them, twisting the strap of her purse. Then, unexpectedly, she stepped toward me. Alone. I didn't know, she said quietly. I frowned slightly about what her eyes dropped. The hospital. I knew Mom said you were dramatic, but I didn't know she actually let you drive yourself. I studied my sister carefully. For years I had blamed Victoria for everything because she benefited from the system that hurt me, but standing there now, she suddenly looked less like an architect and more like another product of Judith's design, rewarded for obedience, protected from consequences, conditioned never to question the script you never asked. I said softly. Victoria swallowed hard. I know it wasn't forgiveness, not even close, but it was the first honest sentence I had ever heard from her. She glanced once toward Eloise sleeping against my shoulder. She's beautiful, she whispered before walking away. Outside, church bells rang noon into the cold November air while leaves skittered across the pavement. Nathan loaded gifts into the car. Dolores bundled Eloise carefully into her carrier. I stood on the church steps for one final moment, watching the Enfield family walk toward their separate cars beneath the pale autumn sunlight. Judith moved Ahead briskly, still upright, still polished, still trying to outrun consequences. Through sheer force of presentation, Gerald walked slower behind her, carrying the small jewelry box in his coat pocket. Like something fragile, Victoria lingered somewhere in between, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to follow any of them. I turned instead toward my husband, my daughter, and the people who had actually stood beside me when it mattered. Then I walked down the church steps and went home both. Complaints involved investors who claimed Derek Blaine had redirected development funds through shell companies tied to projects that never fully existed. Small amounts at first, 40,000, here 70,000 there, enough to stay beneath headlines, enough to survive through settlements and non-disclosure agreements, but not enough to disappear forever. Once people started looking closely, Margaret Patterson looking closely changed everything. Wealthy families do not tolerate uncertainty around money, and they certainly do not tolerate embarrassment. Once the Patterson Group pulled out publicly, other investors began asking questions Gerald should have asked a year earlier. Derek vanished fast after that, his number disconnected first. Then Victoria discovered the downtown penthouse lease had never been under his name. The BMW was repossessed from outside a salon on a Thursday afternoon, while she sat inside getting her hair colored. 3 days later, Derek boarded a flight to Miami and never answered another call from the Enfields again. Victoria came apart quietly, not dramatically like Judith, quietly, like someone waking up after years inside a beautiful dream only to realize the walls were painted cardboard. She stopped posting on Instagram, stopped attending country club events. Friends who once orbited her disappeared almost overnight once the rumors spread through Westbrook that Derek's business success had been inflated somewhere between aggressive financing and outright fraud. Judith tried desperately to control the fallout the same way she always had: luncheons, explanations, carefully edited versions of events whispered over wine glasses and manicured brunch tables. Derek deceived all of us. Victoria is devastated. People are being cruel, but sympathy only stretches so far when your entire social identity is built on appearing flawless. Westbrook was the kind of town where people smiled to your face while collecting details behind your back like stamps, and Judith had spent 30 years teaching those people to care about appearances above all else. The irony finally came home to roost. By January, Enfield and Associates downsized half its office staff. Gerald looked older every single time I saw him after that. Not weaker exactly, just tired in a permanent way, like a man who spent decades standing still in the middle of a storm pretending nothing was wrong, until eventually the roof collapsed anyway. He called more often during those months, not to defend Judith anymore, not to smooth things over, mostly just to ask about Eloise. Is she sleeping through the night yet? Did she start smiling? Nathan says she likes music already. Small questions, careful questions, the kind fathers ask when they realize they missed too much already and are trying desperately not to miss the rest. I answered, because despite everything, part of me still loved him. Healing is ugly that way. Sometimes it leaves room for love and anger to sit beside each other uncomfortably. Judith never called directly again after the christening. Instead, she sent cards, birthday cards, holiday cards, expensive gifts shipped from department stores with typed notes that sounded like customer service emails, pretending to be affection, thinking of you during this special season, wishing Eloise joy on her first Christmas. Not one handwritten apology, not one acknowledgement of the hospital. Accountability remained the one language Judith refused to learn. I donated most of the gifts unopened. Nathan asked once if I felt guilty about that. I thought about it carefully before answering no. I said, finally, I spent 30 years confusing guilt with obedience. That sentence stayed with me because it was true. Every boundary I ever tried to set growing up had been treated like betrayal, every need interpreted as inconvenience, every disappointment redirected back toward me, until I apologized for feeling hurt in the first place. Judith trained everyone around her to maintain peace by sacrificing honesty. Gerald complied through silence. Victoria complied through performance, and me, I complied through endurance. Until Eloise, something changes when you hold your own child for the first time. The scale shifts suddenly. You can see clearly what should have been obvious all along. You look down at someone tiny and trusting sleeping against your chest, and you realize love should never require them to earn basic care. One snowy afternoon in February, Victoria showed up at my townhouse unexpectedly. No luxury handbag, no makeup beyond mascara, no polished presentation. She looked Exhausted, truly exhausted, Nathan opened the door while holding Eloise and glanced toward me questioningly. I nodded once Victoria stepped inside, awkwardly brushing melted snow from her coat sleeves. I won't stay long, she said quietly. That alone told me she had changed more than any apology could have. Old Victoria never entered a room. Quietly we sat in the kitchen while Eloise slept upstairs, and the dishwasher hummed softly in the background. Victoria wrapped both hands around a mug of untouched tea for nearly 2 full minutes before speaking again. He used me. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was more complicated than that. Derek used her, yes, but Judith shaped her into someone vulnerable to men like Derek long before he arrived, raised to value image over substance, attention over truth, performance over character. I know, I said gently. Victoria stared at the steam rising from her cup. Mom keeps saying we have to focus on rebuilding our reputation. I almost laughed but stopped myself because suddenly it didn't feel funny anymore, just sad. And what do you want? I asked. She looked genuinely confused by the question, as if nobody had ever asked her before. I don't know, she admitted quietly. There it was, the real damage Judith caused both of us in different ways. I grew up believing I was never enough. Victoria grew up believing being admired was the same thing as being loved. Both lies hurt. Eventually she glanced toward the staircase where Eloise slept upstairs. Do you really think Mom doesn't love us? I took a long breath before answering. I think Mom loves the version of family that reflects well on her. I just don't think she knows what to do when love costs her something. Victoria's eyes filled slowly. I used to think you were dramatic, she whispered. Then I started remembering things. Childhood has a way of rearranging itself once adulthood teaches you new vocabulary, neglect, favoritism, emotional manipulation. You spend years thinking certain memories are normal until one day you say them out loud and realize they sound terrible outside your own head. The recital, Victoria said softly. Your graduation. I nodded. Once the hospital, she added, her voice cracked on the words. Silence settled between us after that not hostile morning. Eventually, she stood to leave, pulling her coat back on slowly. At the doorway, she hesitated. I don't know how to fix any of this. The sentence sounded painfully familiar. Gerald had said almost the exact same thing weeks earlier. Maybe that was the real Enfield inheritance after all. Not cruelty, but emotional cowardice passed carefully from one generation to the next. You tell the truth, I said quietly, even when it makes people uncomfortable. Victoria nodded slowly, like someone hearing instructions in a language they were only beginning to understand. Before leaving, she looked toward the stairs one last time. Tell Eloise her aunt loves her. I studied my sister carefully, then smudged mascara, shaking hands. No audience, no performance, just a woman standing alone in winter, finally stripped down to something honest. You can tell her yourself next time. I answer. Victoria cried in the driveway. After that, I watched through the window while snow fell softly around her shoulders before she finally got into her car and drove away. Nathan came up beside me holding 2 mugs of tea. You okay? He asked. I leaned against him lightly. I think she's waking up, I said. Your sister? No, I answered quietly. For the first time, spring arrived slowly that year. Eloise learned to laugh before she learned to crawl. Dolores claimed she inherited Nathan's smile and my stubbornness. The townhouse grew louder with toys, bottles, tiny socks, and the ordinary chaos of people building a life instead of managing an image. Some evenings I still caught myself reaching for my phone, expecting disappointment from people who no longer had access to hurt me. Healing was not clean. It happened unevenly, quietly, like ice thawing, one crack at a time. In April, Gerald visited. Alone again this time, he brought old photo albums from my childhood, real ones, not the polished framed versions Judith displayed for guests. These were messy, honest photos of me missing front teeth, covered in mud at science camp, holding math trophies nobody celebrated properly at the time. I thought maybe Eloise should have these someday, he said softly. We sat at the kitchen table flipping through them together while Eloise slept in her high chair nearby. After lunch, at one point Gerald stopped on a photo of 10-year-old me wearing the silver bracelet for the first time. Huge smile, gap-toothed grin, pure trust. He stared at the picture for a long moment. You know, he said quietly, you were never hard to love. The words hit me harder than any apology ever could have, because children always assume neglect means deficiency. If parents fail to show up, the child naturally concludes she must not have been worth showing up for. It takes years to unlearn that lie. Tears blurred my vision. Suddenly, Gerald reached across the table, awkwardly, uncertainly, and rested his hand over mine for the first time since I was probably 12 years old. I was weak, he whispered, and you paid for it. I Cried then not loudly, just quietly at the kitchen table, while spring sunlight warmed the windows and my daughter snored softly in her chair nearby. Gerald cried. Two old men cry differently than young ones, like something rusted finally giving way after years under pressure. Outside, the world kept moving. Cars passed, birds returned after winter. Somewhere in town, Judith Enfield was probably still trying to arrange broken things into prettier shapes. But inside my little kitchen, something honest finally existed between father and daughter for the first time in decades. Not perfect, not repaired, completely honest, and honestly was enough to begin. Derek's real estate license in Rhode Island had been suspended for 18 months because of fraud complaints tied to fake property values. Victoria found out in December. She walked into my parents' house, dropped the engagement ring on the kitchen counter, and left without saying goodbye. Derek kept texting her for weeks after that, but she never answered. But Derek was not the only disaster waiting under the surface. Gerald had signed an $800,000 personal guarantee tied to one of Derek's development deals. When the Patterson contract collapsed, the lenders demanded payment immediately. Gerald could not cover it. Enfield and Associates started losing clients one by one, quietly at first, then all at once. The same company I had once saved with the Harov connection began collapsing again, except this time nobody called me for help, and honestly, I would not have answered. Judith tried to keep appearances alive. She still hosted lunches, still wore cream blazers and gold earrings, still sprayed jasmine perfume like armor, but people in town had started whispering. Church board members stopped returning her calls. The country club asked her to resign from the fundraising committee. One woman told Dolores at the grocery store, "I heard something happened with their daughter during childbirth." News travels strangely in small towns. Truth travels slower than gossip, but it lasts longer when it finally arrives. Victoria called me in February, first time since the christening. "Derek's gone," she said quietly. "Mom and Dad might lose the house." I stood in the kitchen holding Eloise against my shoulder while she slept. "Can you help?" Victoria asked. I closed my eyes for a second before answering. "I'm sorry about Derek, but I can't fix what I didn't break." She cried softly after that, not dramatic crying, exhausted crying, the kind that comes when your whole life stops making sense at once. Gerald filed for Chapter 11 in March. The Westbrook house went on the market 2 weeks later. 4 bedrooms, in-ground pool, marble countertops, 2-car garage, asking price $640,000. I stared at the online listing longer than I should have. I recognized every room: the staircase where I sat after being told we could only afford one daughter, the dining room where my labor contraction started, the kitchen where Judith folded linen napkins while telling me to call a cab. For a second I expected to feel satisfaction. I didn't. Just tired, deep tired, the kind that settles into your bones after carrying disappointment for too many years. Nathan found me staring at the listing one night after Eloise had fallen asleep in her crib. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded once. "I think I'm mourning something I never really had." He understood immediately. That was one of Nathan's gifts. He never forced explanations out of pain. A week later, he came home with a shoebox. Inside were new brown leather shoes, soft soles, good support, comfortable enough for long walks with a stroller. "You wore the last pair through hell," he said. "Thought maybe you deserved better ones." I laughed harder than I had in months. Then I cried harder too, because love sometimes looks like grand speeches and dramatic apologies, but more often it looks like someone quietly replacing your worn-out shoes without being asked. Spring came slowly after that. Eloise learned to crawl. Dolores taught her how to clap. Nathan turned bath time into a nightly comedy routine involving rubber ducks and fake opera singing. The firefighters from Station 12 kept dropping by with stuffed animals and tiny baby hoodies. People kept showing up again and again. That was the difference. Not blood, not titles, not who shares your last name. The people who love you are the ones who arrive when it is inconvenient, the ones who answer the phone at 9:15 on a Saturday night, the ones who sit beside hospital beds and carry casseroles into quiet kitchens and stand in the front pew without needing to be asked. A month later, Gerald called again. His voice sounded older, smaller. "We're moving into a condo next week," he said. "Your mother hates it." I didn't know what to say then. He told me he found my second-grade science fair ribbon while packing boxes in the attic. The bridge building competition, first place. I remembered making that bridge out of popsicle sticks at the dining room table while Victoria practiced piano in the next room, and Judith corrected every misnote she played. I kept waiting for someone to put that ribbon on the fridge. I admitted quietly. Gerald didn't speak for several seconds. Then he whispered, I failed you. Not polished, not rehearsed, just honest, maybe for the first time in his life, and the strange thing was hearing it no longer healed anything the wound had already scarred over. But scars are different from open wounds. Scars do not bleed. Every day Victoria started therapy that summer, she told me once. Over coffee, Mom taught me that being loved depended on performing perfectly, and suddenly I realized favoritism had damaged both of us. I grew up invisible, Victoria grew up